Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brenda Hemmelgarn, and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. And thank you for joining us for this special edition of the Dean's Lecture Series in Faculty Affairs. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, and we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Today's feature speaker is Dr. Francesco Mausecu. Sorry about that pronunciation, Francesco, a proud alumnus with the MD class of 2005, faculty clinician in the Department of Family Medicine and medical director of the Boyle-Macaulay Health Centre, where he has spent the vast majority of his career as a physician serving some of Edmonton's most marginalized communities. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, he has also been serving as medical director of the Edmonton Isolation Facility, where those experiencing homelessness can safely isolate and receive care if they become ill. Last year, the Boyle-Macaulay Health Centre won the award for Patients Medical Home, Outstanding Family Practice, from the Alberta College of Family Physicians, recognizing the importance of team-based approach in serving marginalized clients. At the same time, Dr. Mosquito was recognized by the Alberta Medical Association Shine a Light program, nominated by a mother of one of his patients for his sensitivity and compassion for people suffering with substance use disorders and mental health issues. It is those same unique qualities that helped him earn the distinct honor of being the first recipient of the Richard Fedoruk Memorial Award in Professionalism last spring. The Richard Fedoruk Memorial Award in Professionalism was launched shortly after our former dean's passing in the fall of 2018 in honor of the many attributes he held dear in our calling. In particular, the award recognizes ethical behavior, compassion, a commitment to patient advocacy, and a focus on altruism and social justice. In a powerful show of how deeply Dr. Fedoruk impacted the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, more than 200 donors support this endowment. So with Dr. Mosquito's career-long focus on caring for our city's most underserved communities, I can't imagine a more suitable inaugural winner of an award that means so much to our faculty. So please join me in welcoming him, as well as his two colleagues, Dr. Nicole, Sharon, and Dr. Jessica Kirkwood, who will be speaking today about how neuroscience can be used to understand and support the most complex needs of patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hemmelgarn, for that very kind introduction. It's an honor for me and my colleagues to be here today. And we're excited to get started, but I've just been asked to review a few housekeeping items before we get started. So number one, the session is being recorded and it will be available after the event for those who missed it live or want to view it again. Two, the chat box has been disabled, so instead please find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to submit your questions as they come up, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A session. And third, we have also enabled closed captioning for this event. If you prefer, you can turn closed captioning off or on for yourself along the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you should be able to see the CC box icon. If you right-click it, you can turn it off or on or change the text size according to your preferences. And now I'd like to introduce my two colleagues, Dr. Nicole Sharon and Dr. Jessica Kirkwood. Dr. Nicole Sharon has a PhD in neuroscience from Carleton University with research expertise in experience-based brain development, neurodevelopmental disorders, and brain plasticity. Over the past 15 years, most of them while serving as the scientific director and senior program officer of the Palix Foundation. She has worked directly with professionals across the education, healthcare, and justice and not-for-profit sectors to help them embed this science in their workplaces. She has gained a deep understanding of the challenges facing each sector, as well as the levers to incent and create change within individuals, organizations, and systems. Nicole left Palix in 2020 to launch her own consulting company, R2P Solutions, in order to provide customized and intensive support to organizations and initiatives seeking to turn what we know about brain development into what we do in policy and practice. And Dr. Jessica Kirkwood is a family physician colleague of mine at the Boyle-McCauley Health Center, where her work focuses on providing primary healthcare services to homeless and marginalized Edmontonians in a multidisciplinary setting. She's also an assistant professor with the University of Alberta and a member of the peer team, which works to make evidence-based medicine fun and simple for primary care practitioners. For those of you who are not familiar with the Boyle-McCauley Health Center, I thought I might be able to share a very brief introduction. The Boyle-McCauley Health Center has been operational for about 40 years. And for roughly the last 20 years or so, its mission has focused to serve primarily those marginalized by homelessness, complex medical and psychiatric illness, including substance use disorders. As part of our community's COVID-19 pandemic response, since March of 2020, Boyle-McCauley Health Center has been operating the Edmonton Isolation Facility, first housed in some of the halls of the Expo Center, and since August of 2020, a Southside Hotel. The service provides a 24/7 site where individuals experiencing homelessness can isolate themselves when they become ill. We have provided approximately 12,800 bed days of service to Edmontonians experiencing homelessness, and in the past several weeks, we've been able to administer approximately 1,180 COVID vaccines to marginalized clients. We recognize the support of Alberta Health Services and Community Social Services, as well as many community partners, including Boyle Street Community Services, in these endeavors. It's been a privilege for me to make the Boyle-McCauley Health Center my professional home for the past 14 years, and I'm extremely grateful to be part of an outstanding team of colleagues for the collective opportunity we have to accomplish our mission of serving some of the most vulnerable members of our community. I feel the need to recognize Cecilia Blassetti, who recently retired as the Executive Director of the BMHC after 20 years of remarkable service, and to welcome and acknowledge another excellent leader who has taken over the helm of the organization, Tricia Smith. I feel truly honored to have been named as the recipient of the Dr. Richard Fedoruk Award in Professionalism, and with you, I pay tribute to his extraordinary example and legacy. Today, my hope is to share with you all, together with my colleagues, how an understanding of neuroscience can help us to shape approaches to better support vulnerable and marginalized individuals. Several years ago, I underwent laser eye surgery. A few days prior to the surgery, my wife and I, who have 4 young sons, took our family swimming, and each boy received a plasticized paper wristband on admission. A couple of days after our outing, my wife noticed that our 4-year-old son had not yet removed his wristband. She asked him if she could remove it for him, and he, anticipating my imminent eye surgery, replied, "No, I want Dad to cut it off with his laser eyes." There have been times during my career working with marginalized populations that I have wished that I, in fact, did have superpowers to help me in meeting the needs of individuals who are truly beleaguered in so many ways. As with most skills or attributes we aspire to embody, it goes without saying that developing professionalism is an ongoing process and a journey, often fraught with setbacks and relative failures. In my career, there have been moments where I have not been able to serve my patients' needs in an optimal way. On reflection, it was usually my own understanding or approach to a situation that needed adjustment. I remember being taught in medical school that my patients would become some of my greatest teachers, and I want to share with you such a teaching moment from my career. I remember in my first year as a practicing physician, a woman whom we'll call Anita was referred to me from a community agency. She did not have a primary care provider, and she'd had an x-ray that showed a finding that was very suspicious for a cancerous lesion. I was able to organize appropriate investigations and follow-up, another x-ray, a CT scan. When a tumor about the size of half a grapefruit emerged on her back, which we suspected to be an unusual metastatic growth, She was booked for a biopsy and eventually an endoscopic procedure. The challenge was that she missed almost every appointment and sometimes more than once after it had been rebooked. I was bewildered and frustrated at her lack of what we in the medical community often refer to as compliance to the care plan that I had developed. Finally, one day, after I discussed in a rather frank and even impatient manner some of my concerns at what I perceived to be her neglect of her own health, she taught me something that I have never forgotten. Anita looked at me directly and said, "Look, I don't really talk to anybody about what I'm about to tell you, but I trust you, and I think it might have something to do with why it's so hard for me to do all this stuff," referring to her appointments. She continued, "When I was a little girl, I was abused at home, and so I got put in foster care, but I started being abused in foster care, and so when I was 14 years old, I ran away." Anita related that she was befriended on the streets by a very kind woman who took her under her wing. One night, Anita's friend's boyfriend, who actually was her friend's pimp, put her up in a nice hotel. Anita thought she'd won a lottery of sorts, never having had that experience. But that was until there was a knock on the hotel room door and Anita encountered an older man who was a stranger to her. When he first tried to sexually assault her, she fought back. But after he covered her face with a bed pillow and threatened to suffocate her if she didn't comply, she stopped fighting. Anita shared with me, after it was over, I didn't know what to do, so I just kind of pushed it to the back of my mind and tried to forget about it like it hadn't happened. The same thing happened to me again a few years later, so I just pushed that to the back of my mind too, like it hadn't happened. I didn't know what else to do. Anita paused, and I remember her looking at me and saying, "So when I was told that I had a spot on my x-ray that was probably cancer, I just pushed it to the back of my mind like all the other stuff. I'm not sure how to deal with it. I think that's why I keep missing all these appointments. Do you understand?" My understanding of her and her experiences with the health challenges she was facing in the present changed in that moment. I apologized profusely to her, thanked her for honoring me with this very intensely personal piece of her history, and I hope that she could tell that my efforts to support her changed as well. I could tell intuitively that the trauma that Anita had experienced was affecting every aspect of her life. As it is often said in the field of trauma, the past is the present. But what I was not even aware of at that point was that there was science that had emerged that provided insight into the impact of trauma, not only on the psychiatric and social aspects of a human's development, but also on the developing neurobiological and neurohormonal pathways in the brain and body that could lead to adverse health outcomes in adulthood. An understanding and application of this science could then shape a clinician's or an organization's approach to supporting individuals like Anita. Dr. Nicole Sharon, in her previous role as the scientific director of the Palix Foundation and the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, has played an important role in my awareness and in an advisory capacity, our organization's awareness of the foundational neuroscience that can help shape approaches to supporting marginalized clients. We thought her sharing her knowledge today would be very welcome and important. So Nicole, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for that really powerful story. I think it really serves to illustrate how this information can be useful in an actual on-the-ground clinical application. So good afternoon, everyone. I have the unenviable task of trying to summarize about 70 years worth of neuroscience in roughly 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do is walk you through how experiences change the brain in key ways to set us up either for good outcomes or bad outcomes across the lifespan. And hopefully help to shed some light on how this information is potentially applicable in a healthcare setting. So the first concept that I want to talk about is resilience. Resilience is a concept that's been around since at least the 1970s in terms of the research literature. And at that time, it was thought as being kind of like a lucky trait of certain people, and not really something that could be cultivated or built over time. But over the past several decades, some new neuroscience has come to the fore to help us rethink our concept of resilience as not a trait of some lucky people, but an outcome. So a positive outcome in the face of negative experiences, as well as a dynamic skill or capacity that can be built over time. And when you think about resilience in this way, it's useful to kind of think about it as being akin to a scale, like you see here on the screen, where you've got positive experiences and supports on one side of the scale, negative experiences on the other side of the scale. And a resilient outcome means that that scale tips in the positive direction, regardless of whether or not there's negative weight on the opposite arm. But resilience as a dynamic capacity is really more about how we can create the conditions in which that scale tips in the positive direction. And to do that, we want to load up the positive arm with all of those supportive, nurturing types of experiences and resources that we know are important. We also want to prevent as much as possible the negative experiences from piling up on the other arm. But the other key thing that affects how easy it is to tip this scale from one side to the other is the fulcrum or the tipping point on that scale. And you can think about that tipping point as being kind of like the biology that we're born with. But it turns out that over the past several decades, what we've discovered is that the experiences that we have, particularly in childhood, actually influence our biology in key ways that can either create a tipping point that's in a position that privileges the negative side of the scale, or a tipping point that privileges the positive side of the scale. So this is really about experience-based brain development and how it sets us up on life course trajectories. So what I'm going to do now is unpack these three aspects of the resilience scale for you to show you how these experiences get biologically embedded over time. So let's start with that positive arm. So the first concept that I want to talk to you about is brain development as very much a long-term process. It starts shortly after conception. It lasts long into what we used to think of as the adult period. In fact, our brains don't finish fully maturing until we're in our mid to our late 20s. And you can think about the process that the brain uses during development as being very similar to the process that you would use to build a house. When you first start building that house, you want to start with a basic blueprint. But that's not going to tell you exactly what the house is going to look like at the end of the day. That will depend on the finishes that you use and the furnishings that you put inside. But what it will do is give you the relative size, shape of the house, the number of the rooms, and where they're all located in relation to one another. And in the same way, the brain uses a basic blueprint that guides development. That's our genes. But it turns out there aren't enough genes in the human genome to code specifically for all of the synapses that occur between cells and neural circuits. So there's another process that goes on that also helps to guide development over time. And just like when you're building that house, the first thing you want to do is dig a hole and lay a strong foundation, because that needs to support all of the visible development that's occurring on top. And you know that if you get a crack in your foundation, you could potentially put a crack in your roof. Well, in the same way, during development, the brain is busy laying down, hopefully, a strong foundation of really basic neural circuits that are going to support the development of ever more complex neural circuitry that emerges over time. You get a fault anywhere in one of those foundational neural circuits, and you can potentially destabilize the development of more complex neural circuitry, sometimes several years into the future. And just like where the quality of the finishes and the furnishings that you put into that house will dictate the amount of money that you can sell it for at the end of the day, in the same way, the quality of the experiences that we have during development also help to shape the quality of neural circuitry that we end up with at the end of that developmental process. Now, what I have for you here is development in three representative sets of neural circuits over time. You have a number of synapses here on the y-axis and age along the bottom. And the takeaway is really just that every one of these neural circuits is supporting the development of the next circuit in this particular graph. So when neural circuits start to wire up, there's a genetic signal that goes out telling the cells now is the time to start reaching out, making connections with the cells around you. So you see a steep uptick in synaptogenesis that's occurring as the circuit is developing. So the first circuit in this graph is our sensory systems. Of course, they're important for being able to take in information around us so that we can learn to react to it in some way. And the takeaway here is that these sensory pathways are supporting the development of the next most complex circuit represented by the blue line here, which is language systems. We know that if a little baby can't hear spoken language, they're not going to develop the appropriate language circuitry that will allow them to be able to interpret and speak whatever language it is that they're learning. So those auditory systems are critically important in supporting the development of language systems. And then the last set of neural circuits that's represented here by the red line that are developing, called higher cognitive functions. These are things like being able to pay attention, remember and follow lots of rules, get along with our peers. They're obviously dependent on our ability to take in information about the world around us and react to it in some way through our sensory pathways, as well as in many ways on our ability to communicate with other people. Because keep in mind, we are a social species, and much of our behavior and interactions are guided by our communication with others. Now, what you also see in this graph is a steep decrease in connectivity between the cells in these circuits that's occurring over time. This is a normal developmental process, and it's called pruning. And the reason why pruning is so important is because it happens in a use it or lose it kind of fashion. It turns out that more synapses in a neural circuit are not necessarily better. It's the connections or those synapses that get used the most while that circuit is developing that are going to get nice and strong and stable and remain over the lifespan of that circuit. The ones that don't get used very much, the brain figures, there was no specific guidance system. So a lot of the connections were a little bit haphazard. If they're not being used, they're probably not useful to the circuit. They get weaker and weaker and eventually get pruned away over time. It's the way in which we build speed and efficiency in processing information through that neural circuit. Now, the reason why the pruning process is so important is because, again, it is experience dependent. But what kind of experiences are the most important to have during that developmental period? Well, it turns out that social interactions are the key driver of neural circuit development across the developmental period. We often liken these to being kind of like a serve and return that goes on between a child and a responsive adult. And what it looks like is the child serves up some kind of interaction. We as the adult need to recognize that they're serving, return that serve in a developmentally appropriate way, and ideally in a way in which keeps the interaction going back and forth like a ball being passed between the child and the adult. The purpose of these serve and return interactions are really to ramp up the child's enthusiasm for doing basic types of behaviors or basic types of skills, which will ultimately strengthen the underlying neural circuitry associated with that skill in the brain. So it's really a brain building process. Now let's talk about the tipping point or the fulcrum of this scale. How do these positive serve and return interactions get biologically embedded over time? Well, there are a couple of key ways. The first involves epigenetics. So this is essentially how we control gene expression. Now, I'm not going to explain all of what we know about epigenetics, but what I will say is that recently, or fairly recently in the early 1990s, there was a key set of studies coming out of McGill University showing that postnatal experiences, such as the quality of care that we receive in infancy, actually has epigenetic effects. Now, it turns out that there are potentially hundreds or even thousands of genes that are differentially regulated as a result of the quality of care that animals, as well as humans, receive during infancy. But one of the best characterized epigenetic effects involves the downregulation of the glucocorticoid receptor gene. So by that, what I mean is when animals are raised in low quality care conditions, the glucocorticoid receptor gene is downregulated, which leads to essentially a sensitization and potentiation of the stress response system over time. Now, we do believe that this is our biology helping to set us up to do well in the environments that we are born into. A lot of this work has been done in rodents, a lot of it's been done in primates, but we've seen these same changes in humans as well. These are all social species. And if you're getting a signal early in development that you don't actually have a lot of social support, it might actually be adaptive for you to become a little bit more vigilant in your environment, a little bit more responsive to the perceived threats that are in your environment, because nobody's got your back. But it turns out that these kinds of epigenetic changes tend to be stable across the lifespan. So the challenge arises when there's a mismatch between the environment that we're born into and the environment that we end up in. And ultimately, those changes may not serve us as well if there is that mismatch. Not only that, what we've also discovered is that these types of patterns of gene expression are potentially heritable. They can be passed on from one generation to the next. We now think of this as the biological basis, or at least part of the biological basis, for historical and or intergenerational trauma. The other key way that these social interactions get under our skins is by driving that pruning process over time. So if you imagine a child who's growing up in a stable two-parent family with access to high quality childcare, what's this child getting the opportunity to practice through those social interactions? Well, they're likely practicing forming strong attachment-based relationships with the adults around them. They're likely practicing early language and literacy, being able to get along with their peers, good emotional control. But if a child is growing up in a very different kind of environment, full of family dysfunction, chaos, inconsistent types of support, potentially maltreatment or even abuse, this child is getting a very different set of experiences that is shaping that pruning process in very different ways. They're likely practicing a lot of behaviors involved in fear regulation, anger, and aggression. And the flip side of this is they're not practicing those pro-social skills that we know will likely help to set them up to do reasonably well as they continue to grow and mature. So those social interactions are incredibly important in driving that pruning process and shaping neural circuitry over time as well. Now, what are some of the most important skills that factor into resilience over time? Well, some of the key skills that we know of, that we think of as sort of core life skills, are really executive function skills. Now, executive function is not a unitary phenomenon. It's a whole set of skills that work in tandem to help us navigate through complex social, emotional, and physical environments. So we often think about it as kind of like an air traffic control system in the brain, just like, at an air traffic control tower where you've got all the planes trying to land and take off all at the same time. The air traffic controllers need to be able to pay attention to a number of different banks of radar screens, not let any of those blips get too close to each other. They have to be able to remember and follow lots of rules, different protocols for different weather conditions. And they have to be able to shift on the fly when the information changes, as well as control their emotions, because, air traffic control is a high stress workplace. And in the same way, that's essentially what executive function is doing for us on a regular basis. And one of the reasons why we think of executive function as really being some of those core life skills is because it turns out executive function predicts 3 key outcomes for us over the course of the lifespan. First off, whether or not we graduate from high school versus dropping out or flunking out, as well as whether or not we can go on to post-secondary education, whether or not we can hold down a job and a good job at that, as well as our ability to successfully parent the next generation. For any of you who's a parent, think about how you might employ these skills on a regular basis when you're dealing with your own kids. So executive function is a really important skill set for us that supports resilience over time. And it turns out that our executive functions are located in this area of the brain here behind the forehead and the eyes. This is the prefrontal cortex. And what you see here is a composite MRI map, right-hand view of the developing cortex over time, and here a top view of the developing cortex over time. The blue areas are the most developed areas of the brain. So what you can see is this gradual back to front maturational process where the prefrontal cortex matures last. And it's actually not fully mature until our mid to our late 20s. So there's a very long window in which experiences can influence this ability. So now let's talk about the negative arm here in the last few minutes. What happens when we have negative experiences during development? Well, it turns out that stress also shapes the developing brain, but not all stress is the same. We tend to break that into three major types of stress. The first called positive stress, which is a brief activation of the stress response system. Stress hormones go up, they come back to baseline fairly quickly. And what this does is it gives children the opportunity to practice their stress coping skills, because those are governed by neural circuits, just like any other type of skill set that we have. And we want those to be practiced so that they get nice and strong and stable over time. The next type of stress is called tolerable stress. This is a more serious activation of the stress response system. But the key here is that it's essentially buffered by supportive adult relationships. The adult acts like an external stress response system for that child, bringing those stress hormones back to baseline much faster than they would have, and helping that child with their stress coping skills, practicing those skills. It's the last kind of stress that's the bad guy in terms of brain development. So that's why it's called toxic stress. This is a prolonged activation of the stress response system. And the key here is that it's in the absence of adequate supportive adult relationships to help that child buffer their response to the stress. So what happens is stress hormones go high, they stay high over long periods of time. So how does a dysregulated stress response system get biologically embedded? Well, there's three main ways. What I have for you here is a depiction of the stress response system that I won't unpack for you. But there's three main ways. And first is that wear and tear, which occurs in our peripheral systems over time when we're exposed to chronic high levels of stress. This produces damage to cells that does not typically get repaired. And it can mean that our cardiovascular system, metabolic system, immune system, endocrine system gradually get affected over time and can make us vulnerable to disorders involving those systems. But the two other ways that stress gets biologically embedded both involve the effects of cortisol on the brain. There are a number of different receptive fields for cortisol. The first one is here in the prefrontal cortex. What cortisol is doing when we're under threat is dampening down our executive functions just a little bit to allow us to revert to a more reactive behavioral repertoire. But when this is happening during the developmental period, when we're trying to exercise those executive functions, that skill set, and get that circuit nice and strong and stable, what's happening is it's undermining our ability to practice. And so it can take the development of that circuit off of its best track. And the other key way that cortisol gets biologically embedded is through its interaction with its receptor in the stress response system itself. So as you know, cortisol acts through a negative feedback loop to shut down its own production. But those cells in the stress response system are not designed to be bombarded by cortisol all of the time. When that happens, when they're overactive, what they can do is start removing synapses from other cells in the circuit. It's a self-preservation sort of strategy for these cells, but what it creates is essentially inefficiency in shutting down the stress response system. So we have this vicious cycle. The more cortisol that's circulating out there, the harder it's going to be trying to shut down its own production, and the less efficient we get at shutting down that production over time. So in terms of how the dysregulated stress response affects other brain systems, well, certainly executive function and self-regulation, which we've already talked about. The reward and motivation systems are also affected, learning and memory systems, and social and emotional functions as well. So there are many studies now about the long-term effects of early life stress, but the most famous is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It's a partnership between Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. It was a 10-item survey of over 17,000 middle-class, middle-aged, mostly Caucasian, well-educated Californians, so not a high-risk population, very much a middle-class population. The questionnaire asked about the prevalence of 5 different categories of child maltreatment and 5 different categories of family dysfunction, including divorce. And what they did then was match up the score on that 10-item questionnaire with a number of different outcomes that they had over time. And so what we've seen from this study and from others is that adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are linked with increases in developmental delays early in life, poor academic achievement, mood disorders such as depression and anxiety, suicide attempts, substance misuse, all sorts of chronic diseases, as well as different types of social outcomes like homelessness, unemployment, and criminal behavior. And when you think about this, it really does make sense because, for example, in the case of substance misuse or addiction, we know that many of the structures that are involved in that particular chronic disease, such as the hippocampus, the nucleus accumbens, the prefrontal cortex, they're all affected by that early life stress. And so we often think about addiction as being predicated by, well, you know, you're using, it's the drugs that actually cause the addiction. And while it's true that drugs of abuse do cause their own changes when we're exposed to them in these neural circuits, it turns out that not everyone who uses actually gets an addiction. And that's potentially because, at least for some people, neural systems involved in that disorder are already vulnerable to the effects of those substances. So where do we go from here? Well, we come back to the concepts of resilience. So it's really about those positive experiences and supportive relationships that build resilience in children as well as in adults, because it turns out that it's never too late to change the brain. This is the brain's ability to change in response to experiences. Of course, it's highest in the early years, but what you'll notice is it never goes to zero. What happens, though, is that the amount of time, effort, and resources that are required to make that change do increase over time. And I'm sorry, I went a couple of minutes over. What I'll do now is stop here and turn it back over to Francesco and Jessica to take it away.
Thank you, Nicole. Sure have appreciated your insights there. So I remember when I first learned about the ACEs study and the implications it had in childhood development and the impact on adult health. It was October 2014, and this screenshot here is actually a video of the lecture that Rob Anda, who was a co-principal investigator of the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study, gave, and I was sitting there in person watching this in Calgary, and I was absolutely blown away at what the research was showing, that there was a latter dose response that correlated or that linked the occurrence of adverse childhood experiences with adverse health outcomes in adulthood, and then all the neural pathways that were involved in that occurring. And I remember having two really distinct thoughts. And the first one was, I kind of wish this had been the very first lecture I'd heard in medical school. I really felt that this was so foundational. And at that time, I'd been working at the Beaumont Health Center for about 5 years and seeing a disproportionately heavy burden of illness and suspecting a disproportionately heavy burden of trauma, and thinking this is so important. And it's the first time I'm hearing about it. And the second one was, how does this what does this look like in the context of the Edmonton inner city? And in the ACEs study, they looked, as Nicole mentioned, at different risk factors. And in the end, there were 10 risk factors that were really linked to adverse health outcomes. And those were different forms of abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, neglect, physical and emotional neglect, and then untreated mental illness. If a family member or relative had been incarcerated, the presence of substance use disorders in a home, if a mother or a parental figure was treated violently, and separation from a biological parent through divorce, suicide, murder, etc. And the outcome of the ACEs study was that of 17,000 people that had been surveyed in what was the general population there in California, there was a prevalence of high ACE scores of about 12.5%. And a high ACE score is if an individual answers yes to 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. And the prevalence was about 12.5%. And my intuition told me that the burden of illness that we were seeing in our clients at the Beaumont Health Center, like I said, was disproportionately high compared to the general population in Edmonton and other places. And we suspected that the trauma that had been experienced was as well. And so we started to look and see, well, who else is using this science and trying to apply it in clinical practice? The World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, obviously having led the first study. Harvard has an entire department on the Center on the Developing Child that takes this science and tries to embed it into clinical practice. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Recently, in the last few months, JAMA Cardiology published a study that looks further into the association of ACEs with cardiovascular disease in adulthood. And then in Alberta, a real champion has been the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative and had been for the last many years, and invested a lot into multiple sectors through Alberta to help bring an awareness of this science and try to help embed it in policy and, most important, practice. And so at the Beaumont Health Center, I had started and I just piloted using the survey with 66 clients. And I found that the prevalence of high ACE scores was about 84% among the clients, which was consistent with our suspicion that most of our clients had experienced a very high amount of toxic stress or through the adverse experiences they'd had in childhood. And what that led us to was a partnership over a number of years with the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, with 4 other Alberta not-for-profit organizations and 10 other US not-for-profit organizations. And we learned together how to understand, how to assimilate and then apply the science into frontline practice. And I will say, for many, many years, I believe that many organizations like the Beaumont Health Center, other organizations in the inner city, and many of you, our colleagues at the university and other sites, have intuitively understood and been able to respond compassionately to individuals who we suspect have experienced high degrees of trauma in their lives. However, this science creates an opportunity to use language and creates an opportunity to, in a really intentional way, develop approaches that can help us to inform and educate our clients, to inform and educate ourselves, and to work together to foster hope and resilience. And so as we continued conducting ACE surveys with our clients, and my personal approach is often a cue would be a patient expressing self-deprecating sentiments, that the self-loathing, the guilt, the shame, the feeling of frustration at never being able to move ahead in life or to overcome certain challenges. And I say, you know, there was a study that was done in the early 90s. Can I tell you about it? It was the ACEs study. And I start right with Dr. Vince Felitti started with an obesity study that demonstrated high prevalence of childhood sexual abuse. And then it expanded to the CDC study with 17,000 participants. And then it's grown. And I talked to my clients about how developmental trauma could be impacting their health outcomes in the present. And so I'd sit down and we'd go through these, and clients would just have to answer yes or no, and the results were recorded. And just for comparison, in 2013, Tuff McDonald published a study that looked at prevalence of high ACE scores in the Alberta population, having surveyed 1,200 and just under 1,200 individuals. And they did omit 2 questions, but the prevalence of high ACE scores, so ACE scores of 4 or greater, was about 12%, which was quite comparable to this to the data that the CDC had produced. When we surveyed the Boyle-Macaulay clients, and as of March 2019, we had 225. I think we're closer to about 300, bearing in mind that each kind of survey takes about a half hour to roll out, and then COVID hit before we could gather more data. That of the clients that we'd surveyed, that the prevalence of high ACE scores was about 93%, which to me was staggering, but not surprising. And in a more recent study, there's been in CMAJ in the last few months, there's a study done showing Canadian prevalence of a high ACE scores. And again, it's about 8.2% for women and 13.4% for men, compared again to the Boyle-Macaulay prevalence, which was much higher. And, you know, I would never ask clients to disclose their trauma, but many would feel safe enough to do that. And some of the stories are very troubling, but I would be misleading you if I told you that that was the most impactful thing that I'd heard or learned. What I'd learned instead was how much hope and how much relief an understanding of the science and an application to it can help in opening a doorway to help clients to engage in the care we offer. And Dr. Jessica Kirkwood, my colleague at the Boyle-Macaulay Health Center, has become a wonderful champion of this work and really speaks from the heart about these things. And so we're honored to have her join us as well. Jess.
Thanks so much, Francesco. I have to say, being here today, I feel like a bit of a fraud. And that's because I remember very clearly the meeting where Francesco presented this information to us and said, and I'm really thinking about talking to our patients about this. And I really encourage everyone to be looking at ways we can use this in our practice. And I was one of these staff that was pretty worried about getting started because I had a few hesitations. First of all, am I going to offend my patients when I'm asking these questions? Are they going to wonder that I'm coming straight out of left field when I'm talking to them? What if I re-traumatize a client by bringing up these events from their childhood? And what if I make them feel hopeless when I tell them that their score is quite high and comparatively so to other Albertans? And at the time when he brought this up, we didn't have a psychologist that was affiliated with our clinic. We didn't have a psychiatrist that was affiliated with our clinic. And I was feeling pretty ill prepared to be the person when we finished this and I said, oh, here's your score, where to go from there. I didn't feel like we had the mental health supports that we needed. And so I wasn't sure. I was very hesitant, but I decided, okay, here's the thing about me is I really like being liked. And so I thought if I brought this out for my new patient visits, that maybe then, you know, patients would be like, whoa, this is like a really good doctor. She even asked me about my childhood. I'm hooked. And so that was sort of how I felt. I wasn't sure how I was going to ask patients that I had already been seeing for years because I thought they might wonder, why now, Dr. K? Why do you care now? But I thought, okay, I'm going to do this with new patients. And I was kind of like awkwardly trying to do this and figure out how to do it because I'm sure it's clear to everyone that's here today, Francesco is an absolutely amazing clinician and a friend and a colleague and a mentor of mine. And so if he thought this is a good idea, like, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I distinctly remember I saw this patient for a new visit and we get an hour with our new patients and he really wasn't wanting to be there. And shortly into the visit, neither was I because he was just laying on the bed, not making any eye contact. And every single question I asked was answered with like a grunt or a uh-huh or nuh-uh. And I thought, this is going to be a very, very long hour for the both of us. And so I thought, hey, here's my perfect opportunity. I'm going to pull out this ACEs thing and I'm going to see what happens. And so I started by, as Francesco has mentioned, introducing the concept and why we care and how learning about his childhood would help me understand as his family doctor what risks he might have psychologically and physically and how I could manage those. And we went through the questionnaire and it didn't take long. And I get goosebumps when I think about it. And I had goosebumps on my arms at the time because this man went from completely disengaged. The first couple, well, first I asked him for his consent that we could do it, but once we started, he said yes. And within the first couple questions, he's kind of looking at me, and then he's kind of up on his elbow on the bed. And by the end of 10 questions, he's sitting up, he's leaning forward, and he's completely engaged. He is transformed entirely. And I'm going, holy, something just happened here, because I didn't expect that to happen. And unfortunately, he was consistent with the statistics you've seen. His score was a 9 out of 10. And so I like to, well, and I also still had in my mind, am I traumatizing people with this? So I just said, thank you so much for sharing that with me. How does that make you feel? And his response was, well, I mean, I know about my childhood. I'm not surprising myself with any of this. I've known about this my whole life. But how do you feel, Doc? How do you feel, Doc? He was asking me about vicarious trauma. He may not have known that, but and you might be surprised to know that many of my clients, after completing an ACEs questionnaire, will ask me how that information affected me, not how it affects them. That's incredible. That speaks to the amazing people that we get to work with every day. He also asked, do you really care about this stuff? No one's ever asked me this before. Yeah, I really do. And again, I reinforced how this information was really important to help me be a good doctor to him. And I really meant it. I didn't just care what he thought of me, I really meant it. And I learned through that one interaction very early on that this process was so much more than a score or a number, that this was an approach that could lead to more engagement in primary care and the type of services that we offer at our clinic. And that had me sold 100%. So I'll bring the slides back up for a moment, and I'll just go over again really quickly how you can engage or how you can practically use ACEs within your practice. First of all, you really want to ask. You want to get consent from somebody, but I've been very, very surprised. I could probably count on one hand the number of patients that have said that they didn't want to, or that maybe they just didn't want to today talk about their childhood, and that's okay. But many, many people, you know, they're more surprised, like, oh, you want to know more about me, and we really do. You can do it together or privately. So I have talked to other clinicians that use it as a paper questionnaire. That's totally fine too. So offering a few options, using those results. And the key here is to focus on resilience. And Francesco is going to give his example of what he likes to use. So I'm not going to go into it because I'm stealing his now. I steal lots of things from my colleague, and I'm going to try to do this. But really focusing on the resilience. I said to him, wow, you've been through so much, and yet here you are today seeing me to get a family doctor to improve your health. I think you're amazing. And remembering that you don't have to have an ACE score or do this questionnaire to provide trauma-informed care. Now that we've seen these statistics, and we knew it before, but we really know it now, these patients that we're working with and that we have the pleasure of working with are highly, highly traumatized individuals, and we need to change the way that we provide care so that they feel safe in our setting. How has this changed for us? Well, this information has been really valuable. As it says, it's deepened our understanding of developmental trauma. We ask our patients more, what happened to you? What have you experienced? Instead of what's wrong with you, not like we did that before, but like, why do you do the things you do? Why have you relapsed? Society treats our patients as bad people that do bad things. And we know very clearly that these are hurt individuals that are doing anything they can to survive in a structure that is not made for them. So another way that we found to support our patients is, instead of hiring more physicians during the fentanyl crisis, we hired 2 trauma psychologists, and we have more mental health supports that have been absolutely fundamental to providing this care. And lastly, just really continuing to integrate this work into our organization's core values, informing our interagency work that we rely on so heavily with the work that we do. So if this has motivated you in any way to get more information, the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative has a free online course that that you can go to if you just Google Brain Story Certification, and it's really, really an excellent way to inform yourself a bit more about this really great work. And I'm going to pass it back to Francesco now.
Thanks, Jess. So in conclusion, you know, when we looked at the prevalence of high-risk ACE scores in the Beaumont health population, and, you know, these are clients that we see all through the city, but who many of them access primary healthcare services downtown. and compare them to studies that have been done at the CDC, the recent Canadian study, the Alberta study, there's a staggering amount of developmental trauma that is held in this population, which, as we know, can be linked to adverse health outcomes in adulthood. And what it does is create an approach, or we can create an approach using this information to then build resilience and trust and hope in our clients, who then respond to our efforts to engage them in initiatives that help to optimize their wellness. And that is really, I think, a developing frontier where we have the science and now it's learning how to use it in clinical practice in a way that's effective. One analogy that really resonates with a lot of my clients is the one I call the invisible gym. And I'll leave you with this. So a lot of times when a client expresses a lot of doubt and fear and self-loathing at the struggles they face with their life circumstances, or the challenges they have with substance use disorders or their health in general. And I talk to them, I say, imagine you go into a gym, and the special thing about this gym is that all the weights are invisible. And you go into the gym and you see this first guy, and he is actually looking like he's having a good time in a gym. He's lifting effortlessly. He's doing lots of reps, hardly takes breaks. He's actually on posters that embody the values of the gym, and he's the poster child. And then you see another individual who's struggling, who is not having a great time, who's treated disrespectfully because he can't match the culture of the gym society, and he can hardly do any reps and his form is terrible. And I say, but imagine if the gym owner came and gave you special goggles that allowed you to see the weight. And what you could see was that the first guy is actually lifting very little weight, and the other guy is lifting enormous weight. And I asked my client, which one do you think you are in this analogy? And they often say, I think I'm the guy lifting a lot. And my point is, you know what? The fact that you're sitting here today, the fact that you haven't committed suicide, the fact that you're trying to be a nurturing parent, despite having this invisible weight of developmental trauma, to me, makes you incredibly strong and resilient. And I often think that someone lifting this much, compared to this much, would be like someone who has an ACE score of 1 trying to climb Mount Everest blindfolded, is what I tell my clients. And it resonates with them. From her recently published book, Dr. Kelly Harding, a psychiatrist, wrote, speaking to the role and responsibilities that clinicians have in addition to having their skills and competences. Ultimately, what affects our health in the most meaningful ways has as much to do with how we treat one another, how we live, and how we think about what it means to be human. Thank you very much for your time. I'm afraid we haven't left you very much time to ask questions. And so we may need to invite those who do have questions to stay on, and invite those of you who have commitments or other things to do to conclude your time with us. But thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hemmelgarn, for this opportunity, and thank you to all of you for joining us.
I'm going to moderate the questions here because they're not going to shut us off entirely. As Dr. Mosaico said, if you have to go, please go. But we do have a really great question in the chat, which is, what do you feel that we as a society or as physicians could do to help build resilience in kids and adults? And so I don't know who wants to take that one.
Well, I could maybe just take it more from a societal perspective and then let the expert talk about more applications in healthcare. What we know is that we're never going to have enough specialists, enough targeted care to support everyone. I think from a societal perspective, we have to start thinking more upstream rather than waiting for these issues to occur and trying to be reactive towards them, which obviously we still need to do. We need to start thinking upstream about how do we get in front of some of these predictable outcomes of tomorrow, so that we can build resilience in kids and families and communities, and everyone plays a role in that. So healthcare is critically important, but so is education. So are all the social services. So is your neighbor. So are the coaches out there. So are churches and other kinds of social institutions. So if we can align everyone, I think, around what it means to build resilience in kids, in adults, in families, we're going to be a lot better off.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nicole. I don't know, Francesco, if you had any thoughts on how, as physicians, we can help build resilience in our patients. I think we've spoken to it a bit. We often see people downstream. One thing that I wasn't able to comment on, just rushing through, but when we have patients who are parents and we've done an ACE questionnaire with them, we can often, as part of building that hope and positivity and resilience, we can take a look at their ACE score and compare it to what their children's ACE score might be, and focus on how the work that they're doing and by taking the time to care for themselves, that they're helping disrupt intergenerational trauma. And I think that's another really uplifting message when doing this in a clinical setting. Maybe I'll move on then to, we've got a couple questions. I'll tie them together because what we've got Jacqueline and Manjula, who both are saying children with chronic medical diseases, or what we're seeing right now, which is children that either are sick with COVID, have family members sick with COVID, or needing to isolate during COVID. What do we think these sort of things that we're seeing now, how will that play out in their future? And how does the current situation with the pandemic play into ACEs?
So,
Tough to say.
yeah, I agree. It is very difficult to say. One point that I like to emphasize that Nicole had mentioned earlier in her presentation is that one of the greatest buffers for individuals or children who are facing toxic stress or the moderate stress is the presence of a loving, nurturing parental relationship in their lives. And a lot of times that can mitigate a lot of the harms that emerge. And so, in the case of chronic diseases, and I don't know if this has been very well studied, but what we do know is that even in the instances where there's toxic stress, that presence of a loving, nurturing relationship can make a big difference in helping to buffer the effects of that on the psychology and physiology of that child. And I don't know, Nicole, any other thoughts on that?
Well, it's kind of an interesting question, Francesco, just for people to know, and from a research literature perspective, what we now know about attachment actually came from the observation of poor outcomes from children way back in the 20s and 30s who were hospitalized with things like polio and tuberculosis, didn't have access to that parental figure. At the time, people with those communicable diseases were essentially warehoused, right, to prevent infection, that type of thing. And it was that observation that led to the theory of attachment and how that guides the developmental process. So obviously it's critical. I think from my perspective, there are some kids who are going to come out of this particular struggle that we're all in, by the way, doing reasonably well. But there's a lot of people who would have been just fine without this added stress. But what the pandemic is doing is burdening families who would have never been on anyone's radar screen. And we need to pay attention to that. And I think your point, Francesco, that supporting a parent to support their child is essentially an intervention for the child. Even if you don't work directly with that child, supporting the environment that they're growing up in, ensuring that that is the best possible environment is going to go a long way towards assisting kids and all of us, really, for everything that's happening. We have a great big pile of red blocks right now on all of our resilience scale that's weighing everyone down. So,
yeah. And what a great visual that was, Nicole. Thank you so much. We've got a few more great questions. Again, if anybody needs to leave, please feel free, but I'll just keep going because I just like to pick your guys' brains. Ria asks, what are your thoughts on why more men die by suicide than women? And what's the best way to find out if a patient of ours is suicidal? I know, Francesco, you had mentioned the numbers being a little bit higher for ACE scores in men. I don't know if that it was also the same in the ACE study. Would like to speak to that.
Yeah, I think in the most recent Canadian study, it was actually the women who had a higher prevalence of high ACE scores and the men lower. That might be related to reporting as well. You know, in terms of being able to understand if a client's suicidal, like I think one would have to rely on the clinical training they have. You know, there's a lot of different factors that might predispose someone to being suicidal. And if they don't verbally express that, then, you know, it is a bit of clinical judgment. And so I would usually defer to a case-by-case clinical decision-making process that would inform, you know, a decision in the moment, because every case is quite different in my experience.
Yeah, no, great answer. Is there any data regarding the removal of children from an environment where the ACE score might be high and then moving them to a different environment? Disrupting that.
One of the best documented sets of research studies on this comes from the Romanian orphanages that have been studied by a number of people, Sir Michael Rutter from the UK, Charles Nelson in the US. And what had happened was, back when Romania was a Soviet country, they decided that they had very low productivity. And so Ceausescu decided that every woman would have to have 5 babies. So this would, you know, increase the number of people in the population and therefore increase productivity of the country. Unfortunately, the population was quite poor. Families couldn't actually support 5 children. They couldn't feed them. And so what happened was, women would have these children and then essentially drop them off at churches, you know, abandon them. And so what the government did was they thought, well, this is okay. We'll build these massive orphanages and kind of warehouse these kids until they're old enough to become productive members of society. And then we'll have our, you know, expanded workforce. Unfortunately, though, the conditions in these orphanages were very, very grim. There were perhaps 30 infants for one caretaker, which meant that all this caretaker could do was change diapers, feed, and that's it for those kids. So it was a case of incredibly profound neglect in these children. And of course, what they found, you know, if anyone's familiar with Harry Harlow's work in primates, you could probably have predicted this. They found that these children growing up were profoundly disturbed. They were even, they didn't even grow as tall as other children. They were quite small. Growth hormone was affected. They lost about 25 IQ points compared to the general population. And psychologically and emotionally, quite affected by the disorder. But there was a study that looked at adopted children. So a number of people from the UK and North America reached out to adopt these children. What they found is that if the children were adopted before the age of 2, the outcomes were fairly good. Not necessarily these kids meeting all of the developmental milestones that you would think compared to a general population in a country like the UK, Canada, or the US, but definitely significantly better outcomes than if children were adopted after the age of 2. And so this again speaks to this idea of, you know, skill begetting skill, those foundational neural circuits which are developing in the first couple of years of life. When they're disturbed, that's actually can be quite impactful on the development of skills later on. So the earlier people can, you know, shift that environment from a negative environment to a supportive environment, the better. Now that's an extreme example, but there are a number of other examples of children who've been removed from environments that are not supportive of development, and with, for some of these kids, some intensive supports, they can actually do very well over time.
Can I just add something there, Nicole? Thanks for that really insightful answer. That, you know, a lot of times, like you're alluding to, there's, you know, if a home isn't able to provide the supports that a child needs to develop optimally, sometimes there aren't other options. And you know, there's a pediatrician researcher out of the Bronx, Raheel Briggs, and out of the University of Oregon, Melanie Berry, who's a PhD researcher, and they've both done really incredible work to try to optimize the ability of adults who have high ACE scores to parent their children more effectively. Raheel Briggs was actually able to use her adults. So she's a pediatrician, so the children's parents would take the ACEs survey, and the parents who had high ACE scores, she was able to focus the resources they had on supporting those children of those parents. And so I think sometimes, and I see this in clinical practice too, that there are a lot of our clients and their greatest motivator is being able to reconnect and reunify with their families. And we're trying to find ways to facilitate that. Melanie Berry did some work actually modeling serve and return between parents and who were incarcerated, so mothers who are incarcerated and their children, so that often the parents who are you know, who might have high ACE scores might be conferring some of those high ACE scores onto their children because of a variety of factors that Nicole explained. But it was really interesting that some targeted interventions are starting to emerge to support parents who are trying to break that and disrupt that intergenerational pattern of adverse childhood experiences being present in generation after generation.
No, that's a great point, Francesco. It's always better. I think we've learned a lot of lessons from what's actually happened in this country as well, with residential schools and the 60s scoop, that having that familial connection as well as a cultural connection, which comes through family, is critically important. And so the more we can support children to remain with their biological family, the better.
Nicole, thank you. And both excellent points. I couldn't agree more with that. We have room for one more question. I know we've got a few, and so I'm going to try to smush a couple together. And we've got a few questions regarding allied health professionals and using ACEs. One, is there a place for occupational therapists? Also talking about access to psychologists in schools. And so I'll just start by saying that I don't know if it was mentioned that when we initially piloted using the ACE survey in our clients at the clinic, it was not just for family doctors to do these questionnaires with our patients. It was actually for all of our staff members. We operate in a multidisciplinary team at the Beaumont Health Center. And so one of my patients may feel very strongly attached to my MOA or one of the LPNs on the team, and actually might feel more comfortable disclosing their childhood trauma to that person. And so actually all of our staff were trained in this. I would say probably the clinicians, the nurse practitioners and physicians do it more often, but anyone can use this as a rapport building tool or a way to get to know a client better and to understand maybe why they're seeing certain behaviors, like Francesco talking about his patient not attending what we felt were very, very important appointments. To get to know that person a little bit better, that was really helpful. Nicole or Francesco, do you guys have either final closing thoughts or a little bit more about that, looking at our other allied health professionals and educators and things like that, and how to involve our entire community with this work?
I would just like to say that I think that this is touching on a really important issue of the where and when to use this survey as an engagement tool. And I would actually say that it does not need to be used everywhere, and it may not even be potentially useful everywhere. But there's definitely a core group of individuals and professionals who have the skills and who can use the information in key ways. I think healthcare professionals absolutely fall into that field. But for example, when it comes to teachers, I don't know that teachers need to be doing a survey of all of the students in their class. This is where trauma-informed practice comes into play. What they need to be aware of is that likely there are a number of children in their class who have experienced ACEs. And so how do they create a safe space in that classroom to allow all of the children to be able to learn to their full potential? And then potentially, for a child who's really struggling, maybe it's the school psychologist who might come in and use that tool in a very specific way. So I think, from an overall perspective, not everyone needs to be doing it. Everyone should be trauma informed though, because it's useful for everyone, but it's critical for some. And I don't know, Francesco, if you have any thoughts about different professionals using that tool as well.
Just echoing what Jess said, is that at the Beaumont Health Center, we train everybody to kind of be trauma informed and to have an understanding of this science and its application. And so, yeah, I think that, the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative reached into really every sector of society almost, in the education system and social, human services, in the justice system, the legal world. And so I think that its implications for application are pretty far reaching.
Okay. Well, thank you to all the participants that stayed on. I know we went over our time. I think this was really valuable discussion and we appreciate your time. And with that, I think we'll let everybody get back to their day. And thank you so much, Nicole, Francesco, and thank you for involving me, even though I didn't have faith in the beginning. This has been such a valuable addition to my practice.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Hemmelgarn, for providing this opportunity, and thank you to Emily Hoffman for being our producer today. So,
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.